Well, welcome to Hopkins at Home. So I want to talk about the partner's prologue and tale, which are unusually linked together. Not all prologues and tales fit together as tightly, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. I also want to talk a bit about the Black Death as it relates to the tale. That's come up a lot in questions, not doubtless because of when we're talking about this. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what is fundamentally important and has been to Chaucer criticism, which is what Chaucer seems to be wanting to say about the partner's sexuality. It seems to be tied up in what he wants to use the partner generally to say, but it's enigmatic. But I wanted to start by talking a little bit about what a partner is, because it's not, although a number of the professions are straightforward, some of them we still have, the partner is not a kind of work, pardoning, that we still have. And I'm going to talk a little bit after that about how he appears in the general prologue before moving into his prologue and tale. So a partner was someone who had a Pope that allowed him to grant remission of time in purgatory. So, and often this was a fixed number. You got X number of years off purgatory if you did this by way of this bull. And the theory of this comes late in medievology. It's proposed, as you can see in the slide, in 1230 by a theologian called Hugh of St. Cher. And the principle was that there was something that was called the Treasury of Merit. And the Treasury of Merit, and it's interesting that it was a kind of monetary image because the partner is so invested in money in many ways. But the idea was that the infinite merits of Christ in his sacrifice and the saints in theirs had created a surplus that could be distributed by the vicar of Christ on earth, the Pope, and the partners were sent out from the Vatican to distribute these merits if Christians were willing to do X or Y or Z. So sometimes it was a confession, I'll talk about confession, sometimes it was a confession and penance. But the partner has, and his description says he has, is a bull, which is the word bull just comes from the term for seal on the letter from the Pope, but it granted him the right to distribute funds in the form of remission from purgatory to Christians. Now, everything the partner says and everything that the narrator says about him implies that he lies. So there's also hanging over this the proposition that the bull that the partner has is itself a fake. But Chaucer never especially says that. I'll talk a bit more about the consequences of the partner's fraud to Christian believers. But let me just look first again at the general prologue and the description of the partner there. The image you see in the right-hand corner is from the Ellesmere manuscript, and it is authentic to some extent. That is, it's a careful reading of the portrait of the partner to some extent. If you look here, shouldn't I move? The partner has hair yellow as wax, he's got yellow hair, and they hang down sort of long and lankly. There's a sense all through, as I discussed when I was talking about the general prologue, that there's something a little off about this person, and it comes out of these details that don't quite add up to a particular meaning, but are all about his particular eccentricity. It's focused in the partner's description on his odd hair and the way that he seems to think of himself, though he doesn't entirely seem to fit the bill, as fashionable. Sorry, I don't know why this keeps jumping. But if you look here in this line, him thought he rode all of the newer jet. So the important phrase there is him thought. It seemed to himself that he rode, and which is to say that he carried himself in the world very fashionably in the new way. But it's also clear that he is a little odd. And the lines that I'll focus on more at the end of what I want to say are at the end of this slide. Nobert had hay, and never shall have. He doesn't have a beard and never will. As smooth as it was as it were allowed to shave. So it's like he's new shaven, but he doesn't shave. And then this line that has troubled readers and Chaucer critics for a long time. I think he was a gelding or a mare. So I think he was either a eunuch or female. And what Chaucer means by that is unclear, but it's usually taken to imply that something about his sexuality, that he was either seen to be gay or however a medieval person would have thought about it, or at least odd. And that matters a lot, that he's just outside the community or just at the edge of the community. And there are all sorts of reasons why that's true, given what he says about himself. And then the other thing you learn in the description of him in the general prologue is that he has all of these fake relics. That's what's important. And in particular, he has pig's bones that he describes as relics. And also Chaucer uses this phrase, he said. So he claims that he is a goblet of the sail that St. Peter had when he went upon the sea. But you're supposed to think that there is some cast him out, especially because the relics, the bones of saints he says he has are pig's bones, on whether anything about him is true. What I wanted to call your attention to were the lines here, and thus with feigned flattery and japes, that means jokes, he made the person and the people his apes or apes. And that line, or that couplet, implies that he is deceiving the people, and doing so in ways that are really consequential, because he's deceiving them about their salvation. And that will come back in some of the things I want to look at, but it also comes back in the prologue and the tale. And so he's also at the edge of the community because he's playing with fire, in the sense that he's defrauding people for money, but he's also defrauding them in ways that could damn them to perpetual suffering, deny them salvation, because they didn't realize that they were being deceived in the merits he was offering them, the treasury, even the confession he was offering them. So he's at the edge of the community in that sense too. He's not fully participating in the Christian community, and that would have mattered very much to Chaucer. The reason I have this image of what is a Puritan preacher is just to call attention to the kind of sermon that the pardoner proposes to give and then in effect gives by way of his tale. And that is what you might call a kind of charismatic preaching. And what interests me about this image is, on the one hand, the kind of ecstatic pose of the preacher here, but at the same time, the reactions of the people around him. Particularly, you can see the woman in the green dress sort of swooning, the man on the rightmost side of the image kind of looking to the heavens. And that part of what the pardoner is doing is manipulating people, but he's manipulating them through a set of techniques that actually activate emotions. And that's really important for not only what the pardoner is said to be doing, but what Chaucer's interested in this, because he's really interested in the way language can activate this kind of response. And that's part of what the pardoner is helping him explore. So the pardoner says that he is using this particular skill. He focuses on his own capacity as a what I call a rhetorician. So he says here, "Lordings," quote he, "in churches when he preach, he pan me to hand an hotine speech and bring it out as round as goeth a bell." So he's talking about how particularly careful and crafted his speaking is when he is in effect sermonizing. And he talks about his kind of ecstatic style here. Then piney to stretch forth the neck. So he's using his body in this kind of stance he takes. At east and west upon the papally beck, as doth a dove sitting in a bed, min handes and mi tongue gone so yet, that it is a joy to see me busyness. So he is himself in motion as he wants people to be. And by motion, I mean that what he is really up to in this sermon, that is his spiel, is trying to get people to give him money for these pardons he's going to dole out, and also to come up and confess to him in order to give him money. And Chaucer would have thought of this in terms of rhetoric, at which we usually define as the art of persuasion. But what a definition I like better is one that's a little bit more rooted in the medieval rhetorical tradition, which comes from a Chaucer scholar who says it's really using language to move knowledge into operation, which is to say, you aren't just telling people things, you're trying to get them to learn this thing and act on it. And that is really the focus of the pardoner's activities and Chaucer in this prologue and tale. And what I want to suggest is that for us, it has something very much in common with televangelism. And part of that is that what the pardoner's doing is technological, in the sense that the Treasury of Merit is an invention that helps people in the church do something. So like a televangelist, he's using a particular technology to motivate people. It twins faith and commerce very closely, the way that a certain kind of televangelist does. There is in the pardoner a potential for a kind of scandal. And there is a kind of logic of self-help, which I can look at a little bit later. And the reason I want to make these points of contact is because it's not necessarily in all that the pardoner does that he's doing things wrong. He's relying on a set of techniques that were quite important to theologians and preachers. But it's a slippery slope he's on for the very reasons that there are these points of contact with televangelism. The differences, I think it's worth pointing out too, just to clarify what a pardoner is that he is, not fixed in place broadcasting his sermons, but he has to move around. That's part of what he does. He carries this bull around, and he says he wants money to support that, because he needs to go around to dole out this treasury. But that quickly becomes a fee for service. We don't know his name. He's anonymous. There's no cult of personality here exactly. But he does represent an institutional position that Chaucer also wants to criticize. So one of the things that the pardoner is trafficking in is what we would call still confession. And Chaucer uses the idea of confession, which I'm going to talk about for a few minutes now, as a way not just of understanding who the pardoner is, but as a way of crafting the relationship between his prologue and his tale. And there are, and I'll talk a little bit more about what confession is technically, but we understand the term to mean, talking about yourself. And Chaucer constructs 3 of the Canterbury tales with their prologues to be particularly confessional. And the pardoner's prologue and tale is one, the Canterbury prologue and tale is another, which we won't look at, but the Wife of Bath's prologue and tale we will. And in those cases, the tales, what's important about that is though the tales and the prologues can be loosely attached, sometimes arbitrarily attached. As we talked about with the Miller's tale, they can have moments of close contact with the Miller's consciousness, but at other times seem to be completely detached from it. The pardoner's tale seems to be designed to illustrate his inner life, to be a confession of sorts from him. And so it's both trafficking in confession and enacting it. And that's a very important part of what the craft of the Canterbury tales themselves. So confession is a kind of a technology, as it's sometimes referred, of the Middle Ages as well. There is no strict point of origin, but the term and the understanding of what confession was for the Middle Ages often did go back to Augustine's text, which he called the Confessions. So written in the 5th century. And in the Confessions, Augustine talks in a revolutionary way about his conscience. So you can see that in the first line here. And by conscience, what's most important is that he's positing a part of himself that is invisible and can only be made visible by talking, by language. So there's an inner life, and he talks about this if you look to the next bold passage at the bottom of the slide. He posits an inner self which cannot be penetrated, which cannot be known by someone else's listening or hearing or observation, unless he, the I of the confession, makes that possible. And this is seen to be a point of origin for a very new understanding of the person, this hidden inner self, which Augustine describes for himself throughout the confessions, but then became important throughout Christianity in different forms. And one form is what you could call institutional, and that is the form that confession took in the church. And this was also an invention at a certain point. That is to say, it was always latent in talking about your sins, revealing your sins. But at a particular point, and I've quoted from a papal set of regulations from 1215. This was the Fourth Lateran Council, a convening of church figures who came up with a set of new regulations for the church. And the crucial regulation from that particular gathering was that every Christian should be confessed, should have confession yearly. And that produced a whole institutional form, not just of confessions, but of people to hear those confessions. So friars, a term that describes a whole religious movement, were in effect invented to go out and provide these confessions. The friars emerged after 1215 as a consequence of this provision. So confession was an institutional form. It became a prerequisite for being a Christian. You had to be confessed every year. And the fact of confession, that you had this inner life that then had to be confessed, became what I'm calling here a cultural fact. So it became part of Christianity. And Chaucer is relying on that in both inventing the partner and talking about him. One understanding of that moment was popularized in the 20th century by Michel Foucault. His understanding of power became very influential in literary studies. But he was himself a kind of social historian. And he suggested that confession produced a kind of inner self that hadn't necessarily existed before. So he calls it a technology that produces rather than discovers the inner self. He therefore understands the self as an invention, and and he insists that this conscience that we all then think we have becomes of substance or exists only in language, right? There's no particular location for it unless you talk about it, but we understand it to reside within us. And this goes all the way, I mean, Freud is now in our deep past, but Freud understood, what I'm showing you here is an image from Freud's theory of the unconscious and what he understood the conscience to be at its most both inaccessible, the form which could only take shape in a kind of language, was what was repressed, the unconscious. But it took for him a kind of physical form in the way that it began to take form in the Middle Ages. That is, that there was this part of us that was inaccessible. It existed, but we could only know it by talking about it. So I'll come back to the issue of the unconscious and the partner's unconscious in a minute. But what I want to talk a little bit more about now is the form, not just of confession, but of his prologue and tale. And it is in technical ways what a medieval listener would have understood as a sermon. And by sermon, I mean a kind of knowledgeable disquisition on a theme. And the theme was almost always a kind of a verse from the Bible, as it often is still in sermons. And what the sermon does is it both interprets it and it situates the theme. So often by way of a story. So you get the theme, you get some speculation on what it means, and then you get a story that illustrates it. And that's exactly how the tale in the partner's tale is in effect part of the sermon. So you get the theme, radix malorum est cupiditas, greed is the root of all evil. And then you get the exemplum, which is the story itself. Sorry, this is jumping around. And so he moves from the theme, which he talks about for a while, and then begins the story. And the three rioters, as they're called in the tale, are meant to illustrate what the problem with greed is. But he also makes clear at this moment that there's a kind of split. So even though the form is a sermon, there's also an extent to which it has the shape of a confession, as I described earlier, which is to say he talks about his intent, but it is different from what he's actually saying. So he's positing an inner self that is at some distance from his words. But shortly, mine intent, evil devise, I preach of nothing but for covetise, wherefore me tame is yet and ever was radix malorum est cupiditas. Thus can I preach again, thus I preach against, that same vice which that I use, and that is avarice. Because what he says in the lines just after this is that what he really is doing is preaching out of his own greed, right? So he's telling people not to be greedy in order to pay him for that message. But that is not my principal intent. I preach nothing but for covetous. I'm telling them not to be covetous, but I am covetous in the preaching. So the split happens there. And Chaucer piles on to the implications of that as he proceeds. And one of the ways you see the implications of this are through the other two sins that he preaches against. So one is greed, and the second is drunkenness. A lecherous thing is wine, and drunkenness is full of striving and of wretchedness. Drunken disfigured is the face, so is the breath, full or tortum bras. And if you think about the rioters, they are greedy, but they are also drunken. So they illustrate that part of the theme as well. And then he also preaches against swearing. Great swearing is a thing abominable, and false swearing is yet more reprovable. The Middle Ages understood swearing in a much more technical sense than our sort of bad language sense of swearing. Swearing for a medieval person was taking either a God's name or a saint's name in vain. So what you're doing is you're invoking them illegitimately because insincerely. And so it was seen as a sin, a real sin. And the reason that those two sins matter particularly is that when the partner is about to launch into his tale, early on in the prologue, even before he's doubled down on all this, the partner commits these particular sins. Thu Bellamy, thu partner, he said, tell us some mirth or Japhas written on, shall be done, quoth he, be Saint Brunyon. So he swears. But first, quoth he, hereat this Alastack, he would but drink and atten of a cock, and richten on these gentles began to cry, nay, let him tell us of no rubbery. So he's saying he's going to take a drink, right? So he's going to set himself on the path to drunkenness, right? And it's as if the pilgrims see what's going on because they begin to protest immediately. But what's put on the table here is that the partner knows that he's deceiving people. That is, he's got this inner self that he's hiding from them. But that there's a self behind that inner self that he's not aware of. And there are lots of indications in the tale that this is true. So he may not know, Chaucer's telling us, that he's swearing and drinking, even though he's preaching against swearing and drinking, that he commits sins of which he is himself not aware. And so what's extraordinary about all this for a work of English literature in the 14th century is that Chaucer has somehow invented the idea of the unconscious at the same time as he's drawn on Augustine's idea that there's an inner life we can reveal. And so the partner is at the limits of Christian life, at the edge of the community of pilgrims, because he's got this deep sinfulness that he can't expunge. And you see this too, in a way, I mean, these lines, I always like to point out when I'm talking about this prologue and tale, because I think they would have been particularly gasp-inducing to a devout medieval Christian like Chaucer. I mean, he wrote them so he wouldn't have gasped, but hearing them, he would have been shocked. And this is when he says, the partner says, not just that he's preaching about avariciousness to be avaricious, but he says, for mine intent is not but for to win, and nothing for correction of sin. I don't care about their sinfulness. I reck never one that they've been buried, though that her soul is gone a black buried. I don't care if when they're buried, their souls, and essentially what he's saying, the expression goes blackberry picking, but what he means is, if I don't care if their souls go to hell. And the proposition that someone who's purporting to be an ecclesiast would not just deceive people monetarily, but would do so knowing that they might be condemned to eternal damnation is shocking and was meant to be. He's not a good person in a fundamental way that Chaucer wants to insist on in this fundamental way. And at the same time, part of what the partner does is he relies on the fact that his dupes, those in his audience, and even the pilgrims, as I'll talk about at the end, have an inner life on which he can draw. So at this moment, I won't read through it, but what he says is, if you have a sin so horrible that you dare not confess it, don't come and try to get confession from me. And what he's doing is he's suggesting that someone out there might have an inner life that they couldn't talk about. And it's a form of manipulation, right? He's suggesting that if anyone stays seated, they must be so soaked in sin that they can't talk about it. He's making sure everyone feels that they must come, get up and talk to him. But he's relying on the idea that inner lives can't be seen unless someone talks about them to manipulate his audience. So I want to talk now a little bit about the tale, and this does bring me to the idea of the plague, which has come up in questions a number of times. The rioters here are immediately absorbed by the fact that death is all around them. And they hear about someone who's died, and they ask about it. It was me told, I'm starting near the bottom of this passage, ye can come here 2 hours. He was per day an old fellow of yours, and suddenly he was a slain to nicht, for drunk as he that on this bench upricht, that come a privy faith men cleppeth death, but in this country all the people slay. And you can see in those last lines that the idea on the table is of a pandemic of some sort. Now, there are two possibilities for what Chaucer's thinking about. And one was a famine that was crucial to the later 14th century, the famine of 1315 to 18. And the reason the famine was particularly important was that it started to break down the feudal relationship between peasants and aristocrats or landowners. There were suddenly not enough people to farm the land, or not enough people for farmers to rely on the needs of peasants to farm the land. So suddenly, this was in a way the beginnings of the development of the middle class. Suddenly it was a peasants' market. They demanded payment, they moved around more at will. And what clinched this trend was the Black Death, 1348 to 9, which killed half the population. So, and this was, as I said, when Chaucer was a boy, he would have, known many people who died from the plague. And so he's imagining in this kind of weird topography of the the rioters, a world in very much like the world he experienced as a boy, where people were just dying everywhere. But one of the other things he's using these images of pandemic to think about is language again. Because the other thing you can say about the writers is that they were overly literal readers, right? They hear that someone around here, or that there's a thief, it's an image called Death, who's slaying everyone. They assume that there's a person called Death who's doing this. And that suggests that there is a problem in language that's akin to the problem with people. That is, that you have to be able to penetrate through the surface to what's underneath, to the meaning. And the way that Chaucer would understood you to do that is by careful interpretation. And that's part of what he's thinking about here too. These writers can't do it. It's very necessary to do it in order to understand the partner. And then part of what he's exploring in The Partner's Tale is the relationship between good reading and bad reading. The writers are very bad readers. And he also explores both the idea of both the Black Death as a kind of informing condition, and the idea of the sin that can't be fully described, both in The Partner, really, with this figure who's sometimes identified as Death by readers, but is in fact the person who knows where Death is. And this is the old man. And the writers have trouble understanding who he is as well. So they see him, and then they say, so he's an old man and poor, and he says, hello. And they say, why art thou all for rapid sabdi fast? Why livest thou so long and so great age? How can you be alive if you're so old? And then the old man has this extraordinary image of kind of wanting to die, but being unable to. Vrienden kan not fin, a man, though that he walked into Ind, neither in city nor in village, that would change his youth for minage, and therefore want he hand minage still as long teen as it is God's will. I'm fated to die, is what he's saying here. And then he goes on in this extraordinary image. The death, alas, ne will not have me lief, thus walk I like a restless caitief, and on the ground, which is me mother's got, he knock with me staff both early and late, and say, Leave mother, let me in. Lo how we vanish flesh and blood and skin. Alas, when shall me bonus spin at rest? So this is a man who wants to die, who's beating on the earth as if it's his mother and saying, let me in, I want to be buried. This man says he knows where death is, and he knows it in two ways, right? He says it's down the lane. If you just go down the lane, you'll find it. What the riders find is a pot of gold that they then fight over and end up killing each other over. So it is death in that sense too. But he also seems to know about death in the sense of this death wish, which he embodies as well. And some have said that what he's a figure for is not death, but the partner's dead soul. That is to say, this is the place in the tale that the partner kind of projects himself as someone who wants to die, as any, because in a sense he's condemning himself by his sinfulness, but doesn't really know it. He's revealing himself, but he doesn't understand. It's his unconscious in the center of the tale. And this begins to ramify outward into the Canterbury Tales as a whole, when you see how that is to say, the Partner's Tale starts to say something about the whole Canterbury Tale project. At the moment when the writers decide how they're going to work out the division of this gold, and it's a intricately plotted moment when they draw straws and the person with the short straw goes off to get help. They plot to murder him. When he comes back, while he's away, he gets a poison to kill them, so they're all dead before it's through. But here the drawing of straws is crucial because it uses the language from the general prologue. And he that hath the cut without to bleed, so the cut is the cut straw, the short straw, echoes the moment and the language of the general prologue. If you look here, now draweth cut, as that we fair twin, he which hath the shortest shall begin. And I talked about that 2 weeks ago in the general prologue. The knight gets the short straw. That seems to be both designed and appropriate. But what Chaucer's suggesting is that there's something in common with what's going on in the partner's tale as that which is going on in the general prologue, or in the whole Canterbury Pilgrims as people are telling their tales. And what he's suggesting, I think, is simple enough, that this revealing of the inner self is what language does, and that the general prologue, the Canterbury Tales is all about that process. And what the partner's prologue and tale shows you is how that process can go deeply awry, partly because you might reveal things that you shouldn't, that becomes true at the end of the tale, and partly because you may not be able to fully reveal yourself. You may be able to hide what you should be revealing, the sort of inner self that needs to be hidden. And this is particularly clear and problematic at the end of the tale. So Chaucer scholars still argue about these moments because there are a variety of possible interpretations and none of which is easy to settle on. And the problem is that the partner, having revealed everything, including his intent and the falsity of his relics, treats the pilgrims who are listening to his tale as if they are the kind of audience he normally preaches to, and so that they can therefore still be duped by him. So here, I'll just read this passage. But Sires, o word vergat I in me tal, I have relics and pardon in me mal, that is in his pouch, as far as any man in England, which war me given be the popis hond. If any of you will of devotion, offering and hand me absolution, come forth anon, and knelleth kere doen, and mekely receiveth me pardon, or else taketh pardon as ye wende, of new and fresh, at every meal's ende, so that we offer all we new and new, nobles or pence, which that be good and true. So he asked them to partake of his confession as if it were legitimate. Why? He's told them it doesn't work. And he makes it worse by baiting the host. And this is a moment when, the host throughout the tales is often emotionally, you might say, incontinent. He's full of enthusiasms, sometimes inappropriate, and reactions. He's hostile to some tale tellers. And here he's particularly hostile, but it's because the partner baits him. I rede that our host shall begin, for he is most enveloped in sin. Come forth, sir host, and offer first anon, and thou shalt kiss the relics every chon, if for a grot, and buckle anon the purse. So there are a number of possibilities here. One is that he's joking, that he doesn't expect any reaction but laughter to this, that he is taking it unseriously. And the problem with that is that he's revealed so much that is so, as I said, kind of horrifying to Christian hearers. And it's also unclear what he wants to get out of the host. As I said, the host is kind of explosive, so part of what he's doing is he's trying to generate a kind of response from the host that might be, enthusiastic rather than negative. But he's clearly taken it too far, and that is illustrated by the host's reaction, which is also a kind of conundrum in that in what it seems to be saying, or what it might be saying. Nay, nay, quote he, then have I Christus curse. Let be, quote he, it shall not be so thatch. The waldest mak me kiss thee in all the breach, and swear it were a relic of a saint, though it were with the fundament to paint. So by fundament, he means excrement. I won't kiss. It's as if you want me to kiss your breeches, your trousers, as if they were covered in excrement. But be the cross which that's saint Elena fund. The wall he had the colloins in min hon, so colloins means testicles, instead of relics or of sanctuary that cut him off. So he's imagining castration here. So that goes back to the description of a partner in the general prologue as a gelding. I will the help cum cari, they shall be enshrined in an august heart. And some readers, many readers, and most modern readers think that enshrining his testicles in a turd is meant to conflate excretion and sexual organs in a way that would reference the mere part, the proposition that he is sexually, as Chaucer may well have understood it, deviant, but particularly what the Middle Ages would have understood as sodomitical. So gay, as we would term it, but not as we would understand it, sinful in the way that Chaucer seems to be suggesting it. So the host focuses in on what he thinks the partner hasn't revealed, but needs to be revealed as a way of reacting to what he deems as an insult at many levels, the partner's assumption that people will believe him after he's revealed everything. And also he's pointing directly at what he takes, what I was calling the partner's unconscious, that which he cannot name. And he's trying to call it out. Now, one reading of this is that it's a kind of mobilization of a kind of homophobia as a way of excluding the partner from the community. And the partner's reaction to this is complete silence. He doesn't have a word to say. But another way of reading this, as you have to read every one of the negative portraits of pilgrims, is that they are part of the Canterbury community. That is, I said they were on the edge, and there's some sense in which the host is trying to exclude the partner, but he doesn't. Or at least Chaucer doesn't show him doing so. That is to say that one of the more extraordinary things, I mean, it's easily to talk about this as a moment in medieval literature when sodomy is seen to be a sin. But it's also an interesting moment when Chaucer is allowing himself to think about sodomy. He's allowing himself to think about someone who is so sinful that he will let other people be damned, who seems himself to be so soaked in sin that he will be damned, and who also doesn't seem to believe that, in anything, and allowing him a place, even though it is this complicated place, and allowing him skills, and to go back to the point I was making about the cuts, suggesting that there's something similar to what he's doing, manipulating people and language, to what all the Canterbury Pilgrims is doing. He's like us, is part of what Chaucer is saying here. And so that is the kind of extraordinary Chaucerian vision that on the one hand creates a difference that is criticized, but on the other hand can't think of anything to do with it, but include it in this vision of the human community. So for that reason too, it's very hard to assess exactly what Chaucer wants to say in the end here, but that's because he seems to be saying two very different things. But I would suggest he is saying both of them. They just pull against each other. And when we get to the nun's priest tale, you'll see how that's very much in a much more humorous mode, but with a seriousness underneath it, a very Chaucerian way of writing poetry and a very Chaucerian idea. Thank you very much